Lost your whole team, Sergeant? Don't worry, we'll send the big boys to clean up your mess. The words, slick with condescension, echoed in the oppressive heat of the Tactical Operations Center. The small crowd of officers and senior NCOs shifted, a few offering thin, sycophantic chuckles that died quickly in the tense air. Captain Marcus Thorne, commander of the base's Quick Reaction Force, stood with his arms crossed, a perfect portrait of unearned confidence. He was a man carved from regulation and bravado, his uniform starched to a razor's edge, his jaw set in a permanent state of self-satisfaction. He looked at the woman standing before the holographic map table not as a fellow soldier, but as a problem to be managed, a failure to be documented. Sergeant Eva Rostova did not react. She simply stood there, a ghost who had walked out of the sun-bleached Hell's Cape beyond the wire. Her fatigues were the color of the dust that coated everything in this godforsaken province, stained with sweat and something darker around the knee. She was of average height, with a wiry frame that his dismissive gaze read as frail. Her face, smudged with grime and camouflage paint, was a neutral mask, her eyes fixed on the flickering topography of the valley where her five-person reconnaissance team had vanished 48 hours prior. Her silence was a vacuum, pulling all the noise and bluster from the room and rendering it meaningless. Thorne saw a victim. He saw a panicked soldier who had gotten lucky and stumbled back to base alone. But Colonel James Vance, observing from the shadows at the far end of the room, saw something else entirely. He saw the way she stood, not at attention, but in a state of relaxed readiness, her weight perfectly balanced. He saw her hands, which rested lightly on the edge of the map table, her fingers not trembling, but still, like a surgeon's before the first incision. He saw the rifle slung across her back. It was a standard issue M110, but the wear on the pistol grip and the custom-wrapped stock told a story of thousands of hours of intimate, professional familiarity. It wasn't a tool. It was an extension of her will. Thorne, oblivious, continued his performance. Intel says a major insurgent commander, the Wolf, has been operating in that sector. He's known for taking prisoners. Your team was probably compromised the second they left the wire. Poor discipline. Poor leadership. It always starts at the top. Sergeant. He gestured vaguely at her, a flick of the wrist that was meant to dismiss her very existence. The air grew thick with unspoken protocols and the bitter taste of injustice. Rostova's lack of response seemed to infuriate Thorne more than any argument could. He wanted reaction. He wanted tears, excuses, a crack in the comm facade. He received nothing. She simply reached forward and with one steady finger tapped a specific grid coordinate on the holographic map, a desolate ridge overlooking the valley. Her focus was absolute, a beacon of pure, cold professionalism in a sea of heated emotion and panicked assumptions. If you believe that true strength is measured not in volume, but in impact, type silence below. The silence in the room stretched, becoming a tangible presence that was far heavier than Captain Thorne's barrage of empty words. He had expected to break her, or at the very least, to provoke a defensive outburst that would confirm his narrative of her incompetence. Instead, her stillness was an indictment, a quiet refusal to participate in his theater of blame. Her focus remained laser-sharp on the mission, on the map, on the reality of the situation that he was so determined to misunderstand. The other soldiers in the tent watched the invisible battle of wills, their initial amusement curdling into a knot of discomfort. They were men and women of action, and while many of them had never seen Sergeant Rostova before today, they recognized the posture of a professional. It was in the economy of her movement, the way her eyes scanned the room without seeming to move, the utter lack of wasted energy. She was a closed system, efficient and self-contained, and Thorne was a leaky faucet of ego, splashing noise everywhere to no effect. He couldn't stand it. "Well, Sergeant," he pressed, his voice rising in pitch, "do you have anything to say for yourself? Any explanation for how you managed to lose 5 highly trained operators? Or did you just run at the first sign of trouble?" He took a step closer, invading her personal space, trying to use his physical presence to intimidate. Rostova didn't flinch. She didn't even seem to register his proximity. Her gaze remained on the map, her mind clearly leagues away, working through calculations and possibilities that were far beyond Thorne's limited tactical imagination. It was then that she finally spoke, her voice low and raspy from dehydration, yet carrying an unnerving clarity. The wind is variable at that altitude. Cross currents from the west at 1,500 hours. It was not an answer to his question. It was not a defense. It was a statement of fact, a piece of raw data dropped into the emotionally charged atmosphere with the weight of a stone. Thorne was momentarily thrown off balance. "What the hell does the wind have to do with anything?" he scoffed, recovering his bluster. "We're talking about your lost team, not the weather forecast." But Colonel Vance from the back of the room felt a cold certainty begin to crystallize in his gut. He had heard voices like that before. It was the voice of a pilot calculating a dead-stick landing, the voice of a surgeon announcing a critical complication, the voice of someone for whom all extraneous information has been burned away, leaving only the essential variables of a deadly equation. It was the voice of absolute competence. Rostova's eyes finally lifted from the map and met Thorne's. For the first time, he saw what was in them. It wasn't fear or remorse. It was a deep, chilling calm, the placid surface of an ocean that concealed unimaginable depths. "Everything," she said, her voice dropping to a near whisper that was somehow more powerful than all of Thorne's shouting. "The wind has everything to do with it." Her gaze then shifted past him, past everyone, to the far wall of the tent, as if she were looking straight through the canvas and miles into the desert beyond, waiting for a signal that only she could perceive. The moment was shattered by the piercing shriek of the incoming fire alarm, a wail that clawed at the nerves and sent a jolt of pure adrenaline through the command tent. The world outside erupted into a cacophony of chaos. The deep, guttural thumps of mortar rounds landing on the perimeter were followed by the sharp, metallic crackle of heavy machine gun fire from multiple directions. Red lights flashed across the holographic map, turning the serene topography into a Jackson Pollock of threat indicators. Men who had been posturing moments before were now shouting, grabbing helmets, their faces pale with the sudden, violent reality of a complex, coordinated attack. Captain Thorne, for all his parade ground confidence, was a creature of procedure, and the sheer ferocity of the assault overwhelmed his playbook. He began barking orders, but they were reactive, disjointed. "Get the QRF mounted. Where's that fire coming from? I need a spot rep now. Someone get me air support on the line." His voice was tight with a panic he was desperately trying to conceal. In the swirling vortex of fear and confusion, Sergeant Rostova was an island of absolute stillness. The alarm, the explosions, the shouting, it all seemed to wash over her without effect. She didn't run. She didn't shout. She simply turned from the map table and moved with a fluid, unhurried grace toward a hardened communications console in the corner of the tent. Her movements were a study in efficiency, each step measured, each action with purpose. She retrieved a specialized handset, its cord coiled with military precision, and keyed the encryption sequence from memory, her fingers dancing over the keypad with a speed that spoke of infinite repetition. Thorne, noticing her, stormed over. "What do you think you're doing, Sergeant? That is a priority channel. Get off that comm and grab a rifle." He reached for her shoulder, but stopped short as she turned her head slightly, her eyes locking with his. The comm was still there, but now it was forged into something harder, something that stopped him cold. "They're bracketing their fire, Captain," she said, her voice perfectly even, cutting through the din. "They're walking the mortars in. In 30 seconds, this tent will be a crater." She turned back to the console, ignoring him completely. She put the handset to her ear and spoke, her words a stream of clipped, indecipherable code. It wasn't a request for aid. It wasn't a panic call for extraction. It was a series of commands, precise, rhythmic, and utterly authoritative. Thorne could only stare, his own authority evaporating in the face of competence, so profound it felt like a force of nature. He was a man screaming at a hurricane, and the hurricane wasn't listening. Outside, The crescendo of incoming fire was reaching its peak, the whistle of the mortars growing terrifyingly close. The end was seconds away, and then it stopped. The attack did not just stop, it was switched off. The roaring symphony of violence was replaced by a silence so sudden and so absolute that it was more shocking than the noise itself. It was a deafening, ringing void. From the east, where a heavy machine gun had been chewing up the perimeter wall, there was a single, sharp crack like a giant's whip, followed by silence. From the north, where a mortar team had been raining death, another crack, perfectly synchronized with the first. From the west, a third, then a fourth, a fifth, 5 distinct, perfectly spaced reports from high-caliber sniper rifles, echoing across the valley like the final, fatal notes of a symphony. Every man and woman in the command tent froze. They looked at each other, their faces a mixture of confusion and dawning, impossible awe. The complex, overwhelming attack that had brought a fortified forward operating base to its knees had been decapitated with surgical, almost supernatural precision in less than a second. Captain Thorne stood with his mouth agape, his shouted orders dead in his throat. He looked out through the tent flap at the eerie calm, then back at Sergeant Rostova, who was placing the handset calmly back into its cradle. She hadn't broken a sweat. Her breathing was even. She had not been calling for help. She had been conducting. Her lost team, the one Thorne had mocked and dismissed, had just saved them all. They were not lost. They were never lost. They had been in position, silent predators in the high ground, waiting for the wolves to come to the bait. And Sergeant Rostova, the woman Thorne had labeled a failure, had been the bait. The silence that followed was a different kind of silence now. It was not the absence of noise, but the presence of a new and profound understanding. It was the sound of assumptions shattering like glass. Colonel James Vance moved from the shadows, his footsteps unnaturally loud in the tomb-like quiet of the tent. He walked past the frozen form of Captain Thorne without a glance, his eyes fixed on Rostova. There was no surprise on his face, only the grim satisfaction of a man whose instincts had been proven devastatingly correct. He moved with the unhurried purpose of a man who held all the answers, his presence alone restoring a sense of order to the chaos-stricken room. He stopped not at the map table, but at the secure intelligence terminal, the one reserved for the highest levels of clearance. He looked at the comms technician, a young specialist whose face was still ashen with fear and confusion. "Son," Vance said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that commanded immediate attention. "Access the Tier 1 mission logs. Authorization code, Vance Omega-7." The technician's eyes widened in disbelief. Omega-7 was a clearance level he had only ever heard about in rumors, a ghost key that opened files so secret they supposedly didn't exist. He fumbled for a moment, his fingers trembling as he typed in the code. The system, which normally required multiple layers of verification, unlocked instantly. The screen flickered from its standard blue to a stark, blood-red interface reserved for active special operations. "Pull up the personnel file for Sergeant Eva Rostova," Vance commanded, his gaze still on the sergeant, who was now methodically wiping the dust from her rifle's optic. She worked with the detached focus of a craftsman, as if the events of the last 10 minutes were nothing more than a minor interruption to her routine. The file loaded, and a collective, unconscious gasp went through the room as the assembled officers and NCOs craned their necks to see the screen. The information that scrolled into view was not that of a standard infantry NCO. It was a litany of impossible achievements. Unit 75th Special Tasks Group, Jaeger Team. A unit so clandestine, most in the room had never even heard of it. Call sign Echo. Status: active Ghost Protocol. Primary specialization: deep reconnaissance, strategic elimination, target acquisition. The list of completed operations was a heavily redacted roll call of the last decade's most sensitive conflicts, each one a black-ink testament to a life lived in the shadows. Medals: Distinguished Service Cross, Silver Star with 3 oak leaf clusters, Bronze Star with Valor. Combat Hours: Classified. Mission Success Rate: 998%. The final line on the summary page was the one that landed like a physical blow. Current assignment, Operation Silent Maw. Objective, to act as bait to draw out Regional Insurgent Commander the Wolf by feigning a compromised reconnaissance patrol, creating a target-rich environment for a strategic elimination of his entire command structure. Sergeant Rostova wasn't the survivor of a failed mission. She was the architect of a perfect one. The validation was absolute, a tidal wave of truth that washed away every snide remark, every arrogant assumption Thorne had made. Vance let the information hang in the air for a long moment, allowing the full weight of it to settle on every person in the room. He then turned his head slowly, his gaze finally falling upon Captain Thorne, who looked as if he had been turned to stone. The colonel's eyes were like chips of ice, cold and hard and utterly unforgiving. "Captain," Vance began, his voice dangerously soft, "you spoke of poor leadership. You were correct, but you were looking in the wrong direction." He gestured with his chin toward the screen, then to Rostova. "What you have just witnessed is not a lucky survivor. You have witnessed a master at work. Sergeant Rostova and her team, Jaeger team, have been your guardian angels for the past 72 hours. They have been mapping every enemy position, logging every insurgent patrol, and building a complete intelligence picture of an enemy you didn't even know was massing on your doorstep. The patrol you assumed was lost was, in fact, a carefully orchestrated piece of theater designed to make the wolf believe he had an easy target. He took the bait. He committed his forces. And Jaeger team, from 5 different, interlocking Overwatch positions a mile away, just dismantled his entire network in 5 seconds. 5 shots. 5 command-level targets eliminated simultaneously. The rest of his forces are now leaderless, blind, and stumbling into a kill box that this sergeant designed. Vance took a step towards Thorne, whose face had gone from arrogant to shocked to a deep, mortified crimson. "You assumed noise was strength. You mistook her silence for weakness. You judged a warrior by the standards of a parade ground. You have done more to compromise Sergeant Rostova," he said, his voice resonating with authority and humility. "I believe you have a report to file. The floor is yours." The story of what came to be known as the Rostova feint spread through the forward operating base like a brush fire in a high wind. It traveled in hushed whispers in the Chow Hall, in exaggerated retellings in the smoke pits, and in encrypted after-action reports sent back to high command. It became more than a story. It became a legend, a piece of institutional folklore that served as a potent lesson in humility. The details were embellished with each telling. The 5 shots became a single, impossible ricochet. Sergeant Rostova was said to have stared down the mortar tubes herself, her icy gaze causing the enemy to flee in terror. The myths grew, but they all orbited a single, immutable core of truth. A quiet professional had, through sheer competence, silenced an army and humbled an institution. The legend was of a ghost who walked among them, but the reality was far more mundane and, in its own way, more inspiring. Rostova and her team, Jaeger team, reintegrated with the base population as if nothing had happened. They were specters given flesh, 5 unassuming soldiers who had held the lives of everyone on the base in their hands. They were seen cleaning their rifles with the same diligent patience as any private, their movements economical and precise. They ate in the mess hall, their conversations quiet and technical, their presence a constant, silent reminder of the difference between appearing strong and being strong. They deflected all praise with a simple, unified mantra. We did the job. Their professionalism was so absolute, it was almost unnerving. They sought no credit, no accolades, no special treatment. Their reward was the successful completion of the mission, a standard that seemed incomprehensible to those who thrived on public recognition. The effect on Captain Thorne was transformative. He was not formally reprimanded in a way the general population could see, but his punishment was far more profound. He was stripped of his command of the QRF, a public castration of his authority, and reassigned to a logistics oversight role, managing manifests and shipping containers in a dusty yard at the far end of the base. The swagger was gone, replaced by a stooped, haunted posture. The loud, booming voice that had once filled the command tent was reduced to a quiet murmur. He had been confronted with the undeniable proof of his own inadequacy, his arrogance exposed not by a superior's rebuke, but by the quiet competence of a woman he had so publicly scorned. One evening, he sought out Sergeant Rostova. He found her on the firing range, long after everyone else had left, practicing trigger control with an empty rifle, the setting sun glinting off the polished steel. He stood for a long time, shifting his weight, trying to assemble the right words. Finally, he spoke, his voice cracking. "Sergeant, I was wrong. What you did, it was—" "I'm sorry." Rostova didn't stop her practice. She completed another slow, deliberate trigger squeeze, the hammer clicking in the quiet evening air. She then lowered the rifle, placed it carefully on the bench, and finally turned to look at him. She offered no words of forgiveness, no comforting platitudes. She simply gave him a single, slow nod of acknowledgement. It was not absolution. It was not condemnation. It was merely an acceptance of his statement as fact. In her silence, he found his final, crushing lesson. His apology was for him, not for her. Her worth had never been in question. The event was immortalized on the base in a small but significant way. The intelligence officers mapped out the 5 Sniper Hides Jaeger team had occupied in the mountains overlooking the valley. The positions, which offered interlocking fields of fire of breathtaking tactical brilliance, became a permanent part of the training curriculum for all new snipers and reconnaissance teams deployed to the region. The training scenario was officially designated Exercise Echo, but the soldiers who ran it, the ones who had been there that day, called it the Ghost Perimeter. It was a map that taught more than topography. It taught a philosophy. It taught that the most effective power is often the most unseen, that the deadliest threat is the one you never hear coming, and that the true measure of a warrior is found in the quiet, methodical pursuit of excellence, far from the glare of praise or the noise of ego. The legacy of the Rostova feint became woven into the very fabric of the base's culture, a living parable passed down from one rotation of soldiers to the next. Months bled into a year, and the strategic landscape of the entire province shifted. The decapitation of the Wolf's command structure during Operation Silent Maw had created a power vacuum that, managed correctly with the intelligence Jaeger team had gathered, allowed for a period of unprecedented stability. The base, once a fortress under constant siege, became a bastion of relative security. The lessons learned that day in the command tent were not forgotten. They were institutionalized. Senior NCOs would take new, cocky lieutenants aside and tell them the story, not to scare them, but to educate them. "Let me tell you about the Ghost Perimeter," they would begin, their voices low and reverent. "Let me tell you about the quiet sergeant who taught a captain, and all the rest of us, that what you see is almost never what you get. Look for the quiet ones. Listen to the ones who don't need to speak." The loudest voice in a room is always compensating for something. The story became a tool for teaching the most critical of military virtues, the humility to recognize expertise in any form, regardless of rank, gender, or appearance. It was a standing order to check one's assumptions at the door. The name Rostova was rarely spoken aloud anymore. She and her team had moved on, melting back into the classified world from which they had emerged, their next mission a secret whispered only in the most secure of locations. She left no photograph on a wall, no plaque with her name on it. Her legacy was not carved in stone or cast in bronze. It was something far more powerful and enduring. It was a standard. It was a way of being. It was the quiet, unshakable confidence that comes from proven competence. It was in the way a young sniper would spend an extra hour studying the wind charts, the way a team leader would listen a little more carefully to the quietest member of their squad, the way a newly minted officer would learn to ask questions before giving orders. True legacy isn't what you leave behind in a physical sense. It's the change you inspire in those who continue forward. It is the silent, invisible influence that raises the bar for everyone. The actions of one quiet professional had recalibrated an entire culture, proving that respect is not a function of volume, but of value, not a product of declaration, but of demonstration. The ripples of her quiet competence spread outward, strengthening the very foundations of the institution she served, a testament to the profound and lasting power of a single, undeniable act of excellence. For more stories where quiet competence triumphs over loud ignorance, and where silent professionalism defines their worth, subscribe to Unknown Heroine Stories.